what he has seen with his own eyes 2 miles down under ice are hieroglyphs that archaeologists that he was in, that was the mission.
Yesterday, at exactly 3 o'clock hours Coordinated Universal Time, a classified satellite array monitoring the southern hemisphere went dark. For 12 seconds, the feed was replaced by a singular, blinding spike of thermal energy. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't a solar flare. It was a signal rising from beneath 3 miles of solid ice at the South Pole. Governments immediately issued a standard denial. They claimed it was an instrument malfunction or a shift in the magnetic poles. But while the world slept, a video file was uploaded to a secure server. A final confession from a woman who has held the highest clearance in investigative journalism for 40 years. She didn't speak of politics. She didn't speak of war. She spoke of a structure buried in Antarctica that has been silent for 12,000 years. She warned that the heat signature picked up by those satellites wasn't a geological event. It was a biological one. The ice isn't just melting, it is being pushed aside. Something down there has stopped sleeping. And by the time this video ends, you will understand why the silence of the last millennium has finally been broken. The story begins in 1995, a year before the internet fully connected the world, and long before satellite maps began censoring massive patches of the Antarctic continent. The investigator, a woman known for her relentless pursuit of unexplained phenomena, received a summons. It wasn't an invitation. It was a directive issued by a shadow faction of the military-industrial complex. She was told to pack for extreme cold. She was told that she would be completely incommunicado for 7 days. And most importantly, she was told that she was being brought in not to ask questions, but to document the impossible. They needed a witness outside the chain of command, someone whose reputation could eventually leak the truth when the time was right. Her memory of the arrival was visceral. She described stepping off a C-130 transport plane into a wall of white. The Antarctic wind felt less like air and more like a physical blade. She was immediately ushered into a tracked vehicle with blacked-out windows. There were no insignias on the soldiers' uniforms. No names. Just the roar of engines driving them deep into the exclusion zone. After hours of driving across the barren ice shelf, the vehicle didn't stop at a base. It drove underground. The terrain shifted from the chaotic, windswept surface to a smooth, downward-sloping tunnel. The lights here weren't the harsh floodlights of a military outpost. They were dim, amber, and recessed into walls that looked like they had been cut by lasers. They brought her to a command center built literally inside the glacial ice. It was a marvel of engineering, a steel deck suspended over a chasm that dropped into the abyss. But the soldiers weren't looking at their equipment. They were staring at the main view screen. On the monitor was a sonar rendering of what lay beneath them. It was a perfect geometric tetrahedron, a black pyramid, buried 3 miles deep. The commander of the operation turned to her. His face was pale, stripped of the arrogance usually found in men of his rank. He told her that they hadn't built this. They had found it. A satellite initially detected a magnetic anomaly so powerful it distorted the navigation of aircraft flying overhead. When they drilled down, they didn't hit rock. They hit a black, metallic surface that defied sampling. Diamond drill bits shattered against it. Lasers dispersed upon contact. It was composed of a material that felt soapy to the touch, yet possessed the density of a collapsed star. But the most terrifying detail wasn't the durability. It was the temperature. Despite being entombed in ice that hovered at 60 degrees below zero, the structure was warm. It was generating a precise, regulated heat signature. It was maintaining an environment. They took her down. The elevator was a reinforced freight platform that rattled violently as it descended the 3-mile shaft. As they passed the layer of bedrock, the rough ice gave way to architecture. The walls became smooth, dark, and seamless. There were no rivets, no joint lines, no signs of construction. It was as if the entire facility had been grown, not built. When the doors opened, the air changed. It was crisp, oxygen-rich, and smelled faintly of ozone. She described walking into a corridor that curved in impossible angles, disorienting the inner ear. But what caught her eye were the walls. They were covered in bioluminescent glyphs. These weren't random scratches. They were complex, flowing scripts that pulsed with a faint blue light, mimicking the rhythm of a slow, resting heartbeat. She recognized the patterns immediately. They bore a striking resemblance to cuneiform found on ancient Sumerian tablets. The language of the Anunnaki, the mythological, those who from heaven came. Against orders, she reached out. Her gloved hand grazed a section of the glowing script. The reaction was instantaneous. A shock wave of static electricity surged through her arm, not painful but communicative. The lights in the corridor flared brighter. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor plates. The commander grabbed her, shouting that the structure was reactive. It could sense biology. It knew they were there. They pressed deeper, entering a central hall with a ceiling so high it vanished into the shadows above. In the center of the room stood the reason for the secrecy. It wasn't a weapon. It was a sarcophagus. Made of a crystalline material that refracted light into shifting rainbows, the pod was suspended above the floor by magnetic fields. Inside lay a figure. It was humanoid but distinctly not human. She described it as nearly 9 feet tall, with pale, gold-tinted skin and features that were too symmetrical to be natural. It looked engineered. The entity was wearing a suit that looked like a second skin, metallic and woven into the nervous system. Its eyes were closed. But as the scientists moved around it, the investigator noticed something that made her blood run cold. The cables attached to the pod weren't feeding it power. They were monitoring it. This wasn't a tomb. It was a waiting room. The being inside was in a state of suspended animation, a dormancy that had lasted for thousands of years. But the readout on the military consoles showed brain activity. It was dreaming. It was aware. The turning point came when a lead scientist attempted to interface with the control console near the sarcophagus. As he inputted a frequency code, the room violently shifted. The low hum escalated into a deafening roar. The floor shook, knocking the soldiers to their knees. The glyphs on the walls changed color, shifting from a passive blue to an urgent, angry red. And then she heard it. Not with her ears, but directly in the center of her mind. A voice, clearer than any spoken word, projected a single command: awaken. The commander panicked. He ordered an immediate evacuation. As they scrambled back toward the elevator, the magnetic field in the room spiked. The investigator looked back one last time. The crystalline sarcophagus was vibrating. The golden figure inside hadn't moved, but the air around it was warping as if space itself was bending to its will. They sealed the shaft with high-grade explosives. They buried the entrance under tons of snow and ice. The investigator was flown out, debriefed, and threatened with treason if she ever spoke a word. For decades she kept that secret. She watched as the world developed the internet, smartphones, and AI, knowing all the while that a stopwatch was ticking beneath the ice. Fast forward to the present day. The investigator, now frail and nearing the end of her life, decided the world could no longer afford the luxury of ignorance. She released her testimony. But her words were just the beginning. Within hours of her confession going viral, the physical evidence began to mount. Seismographs across the southern hemisphere picked up a rhythmic tremor. It wasn't the chaotic shaking of an earthquake. It was a pulse. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat the size of a mountain. Marine biologists reported a sudden, mass exodus of wildlife. Whales, seals, and penguins were fleeing the Antarctic coastline in patterns that defied migration logic. They were running from something. And then came the satellite imagery. The climate change narrative crumbled when a thermal bloom appeared directly over the coordinates she had provided. The ice wasn't melting from the top down due to greenhouse gases. It was melting from the bottom up. A massive column of heat was boring a hole straight through the glacier to the sky. In the final hours of the narrative, the investigator did something reckless. Driven by a compulsion she described as a summoning, she boarded a private charter to the edge of the exclusion zone. This time there were no soldiers to stop her. The base was in chaos. She found her way back to the site. The explosives used to seal the entrance had failed. The ice had simply liquefied, creating a direct path to the Black Pyramid. She descended, guided not by military escorts, but by the pulse of the machine itself. When she reached the central hall, the crystalline pod was open. The golden figure stood in the center of the room. It towered over her, its metallic eyes glowing with a luminescence that illuminated the ancient glyphs. It did not speak. It didn't need to. It projected a vision, a download of history and future. She understood then that the structure was not a bunker. It was a cosmic clock. It was designed to activate only when the civilization on the surface reached a specific technological threshold. We had split the atom. We had created artificial intelligence. We had reached for the stars. The experiment was over. The entity raised a hand, and the energy surge that hit the satellites yesterday was released. The investigator's final message to humanity was not a plea for help, but a clarification of our reality. She explained that the apocalypse mentioned in ancient texts was a mistranslation. It doesn't mean the end of the world. It means the lifting of the veil. We have been in a cycle of incubation, watched over by silent guardians who buried themselves in the most inhospitable place on Earth to wait for us to mature. But there is a twist. The awakening isn't a guarantee of safety. It is a trial. The blue pulse was a scan, a global assessment of our species. Are we creators or are we destroyers? As the auroras over the South Pole turn a deep, unnatural violet, and the global hum gets louder, we are left with the chilling realization that the judgment has already begun. The watcher is awake. The test has started. And looking at the state of our world today, we have to wonder, did we wake them up to greet us or did we wake them up to reset us? But that is a mystery for the next cycle.